Leviticus chapter 20, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Say to the people of Israel, any one of the people of Israel or of the strangers who sojourn in Israel who gives any of his children to Molech shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones. I myself will set my face against that man and will cut him off from among his people, because he has given one of his children to Molech, to make my sanctuary unclean and to profane my holy name. And if the people of the land do at all close their eyes to that man when he gives one of his children to Molech and do not put him to death, then I will set my face against that man and against his clan and will cut them off from among their people, him and all who follow him in whoring after Molech. And if a person turns to mediums and necromancers, whoring after them, I will set my face against that person and will cut him off from among his people." Severe warnings here to open up Leviticus chapter 20, where we're continuing on in the book of Leviticus in a section where we're seeing the law codes in ancient Israel, laws for God's Old Testament era people. And as we saw in chapter 18, many restrictions. In this chapter, we're going to see not just the restrictions, many of them repeated from chapter 18 here in chapter 20, but we're going to see the punishment that needed to be meted out for the crimes that were mentioned in chapter 18. In a sense, this chapter is going to reinforce that earlier chapter, chapter 18. Now, except for verse 19, 20, and 21 in this chapter, which of course we'll get to as we read through this chapter, every crime that's mentioned in this chapter was worthy of the death penalty. Some wonder if that meant that they were meant to penalize people up to the death penalty, that they could qualify for the death penalty, but sometimes meted out judgments that were less than, or were allowed to mete out judgments less than the death penalty. And others believe that, no, this was God's intention, that they would execute this death penalty, that they would use this death penalty, and that the times that they didn't was actually disobedience to the Lord. But the sins that are mentioned here, carrying out this penalty of death, they of course cause us to realize the sober nature of each one of these crimes. And as you go through the law and the commands or the rules that if Israel committed them or broke them, they'd be guilty and be under the death penalty, they are very severe. Premeditated murder, kidnapping, murder itself, adultery, homosexuality, blasphemy, idolatry, disobedience against authority. All of these things would qualify for death penalty. And if you really think about them, what they were sins that would destroy the community. And we'll see that as we go through this chapter together. But we started out in the first 6 verses by seeing the importance amongst God's Old Testament covenant people of operating with a fear of the Lord, a reverence for God. The first thing that's mentioned is the offering of children to this false god named Molech, a god of the Ammonites who lived in that area on the other side of the Jordan River. Now, we've already visited the concept of offering children to Molech in chapter 18, verse 21, where God said, "You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord." Now, most often, what scholars think is happening with the idea of offering children to Molech is the idea of child sacrifice, actually killing their children in the name of the worship of this deity. And there are grotesque ways in which this would occur. There are some scholars who think that there's an additional component of perhaps not only offering children sacrificially, but it pains me to even say this, to offer them sexually to Molech as well. And this, of course, grieves the heart of not just human beings, but it grieves the heart of God. God would see these sins being committed amongst the Ammonite people, and he warned gravely before the people of Israel ever set foot in the promised land, these are sins that must not be numbered among you. Now, what is such a big deal about this sin? I mean, it's hard to even ask that question with a straight face because it's innate to us. We understand the gravity of this sin. This is terrible that a parent would so overturn the natural order of God's design and neglect their natural responsibility that God has imparted into their bodies and minds and souls and spirits, and that they would so allow their conscience to be seared that they would reject the order that God himself has established, step out of the alignment that God has given, God, humanity, creation, and step out of that alignment. Parents saying, I am not only going to neglect my responsibility, but I'm going to harm this person that is my responsibility, even to the point of death. It's a grave and terrible sin, not just because a child is unable to defend themselves, but because a child is looking to a parent to be the one who provides for them, leads them, guides them, teaches them, and shows them the truth. They're looking to a father to protect them, defend them, define them, speak into their lives, encourage them, teach them, and instruct them. And they're looking to a mother to nurture them, to care for them, to bring them along to full strength. And this is an exact violation, an upheaval of the very thing that God himself has designed. And so God is greatly grieved by this particular crime. Now, of course, there are implications for us today by seeing the heart of God in this commandment. It's not going to be a common temptation in our modern era for someone to want to worship a god named Molech in this way. But what can we learn about the heart of God through all of this? Well, first of all, we learn that God is a defender of helpless children. So in the New Testament, when you read that pure and undefiled religion is caring for widows and orphans in their trouble, what you're seeing is an extension of the very heart of God that exists right here. God looking into the brokenness of humanity, seeing the neglect of fathers and the neglect of mothers, and he declares, I want my people to step into the pain and the chaos that sin has created and to be part of that solution. So this helps us understand the heart of God, that God is a defender of helpless children. But it also helps us understand that when God sees elements of our world and society where the natural order of his design is overturned, it grieves his heart greatly, partly because of the pain caused to the person, but also for the pain caused to the entire society that he is observing. And so as God's people, we need to take our roles seriously. The exact opposite of this sin here in this opening salvo in Leviticus chapter 20 would be to say, all right, if this is a crime or was a crime in that era, then I want to be the exact opposite of this. I want, by God's Spirit, to be a great father or mother and a great spiritual father and mother. I want to be one who cares for others. If I need to be a step-in parent, I will be a step-in parent. I'll pick up the slack that others have created. And so I think this is a beautiful thing. Obviously, there'd also be some implications for this, or perhaps it's not obvious to you, but there should be some implications to this, seeing the heart of God, his care for this defenseless child in the way that we might process something like abortion in our modern time. These are babies that are unable to defend themselves. And they're not being offered in sacrifice to a literal god named Molech, but there are false gods that abound, that people ascribe to. My personal freedom, my needs and concerns, my future, all these different things that we can bow down to in place of taking care of these children that God so loves. And so God is a defender of the helpless here. He even mentions in verse 4, this is interesting, that if there's someone who sees this child sacrifice taking place, but closes their eyes to that man, that person who closes their eyes is also guilty before God. This is a monstrous sin that God wants community interjection into. So we as God's people, we should also become defenders of helpless children. But also here in this little section that we just read, we also saw in verse 6, not just God rebuking and highlighting the punishment for this sin before Molech, but also the presence of mediums and necromancers in the land, people who are trying to communicate with the dead, so to speak. And this would happen from time to time in the nation of Israel. You might even remember in the life of King Saul, when he was going mad near the end of his reign, he tried to figure out where David was, and he consulted with a witch in a town called Endor in an attempt to communicate with Samuel. Or Samuel came from the dead and spoke to him and rebuked him from the grave for his sin. And so this actually happened in the nation of Israel. And what God warned here in verse 6 is that people who engage with such activity, they would be cut off. So here what you have is kind of curious, like why would this be, of all the sins mentioned in chapter 18, why in the punishments or the disciplines, why is the worship of Molech and the presence of necromancers and mediums, why is that first on the list of disciplines? Well, I think part of the reason for that is because a reverence for God, a fear of God. I've been even kind of correcting myself lately when I think of the fear of the Lord. Sometimes we want to try to give a definition to that. It's the awe of God. It's the reverence of God. It's a respect for God. The fear of God is all of those things, but it's a little bit more than just that. There is an actual, not paranoia about him, but a fear for who he is that really keeps the word fear as the only total appropriate word to describe our feeling or our sense about him. He's unlike anyone else. And once a person loses the fear of the Lord and replaces God with something lesser, an idol, another worship system, like is mentioned here, a necromancer, a medium, the sins that flow downstream from that worship problem are catastrophic. And so God is trying to fix the upstream issue of worship and fear, reverence for him. And so he's going right after it because it's all about the heart. I was just talking to a brother recently. We were just talking about dating and relationships. And he's just telling me, it's hard to know who to trust because even when you see all the right things, she reads her Bible, she loves the Lord, she's doing the right stuff, you just don't know what's going to happen down the line. And we just concluded it's about the fear of the Lord. If that person has the fear of the Lord in their hearts, and you know that the offshoots from their life are going to be beautiful. So what is going on within the heart? And God goes right after it in this section. Now in verse 7, he continues this list of sins with punishments. And he says in verse 7, consecrate yourselves therefore and be holy, for I am the Lord your God. Keep my statutes and do them. I am the Lord who sanctifies you. For anyone who curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. he has cursed his father or his mother, his blood is upon him. Now, of course, the fifth commandment is to honor your father and your mother, and this would be an offshoot of that fifth commandment. And the idea here is that the cursing of parents is punishable by death. Now, to curse is so much more than just a harsh word, an angry word, an outburst of wrath. So it wasn't like in ancient Israel, you had these, teenage boys going through puberty and lashing out at mom or dad, and then, okay, straight to the rock pile, you're going to die kind of thing. This is something much more grave or serious than that. In fact, you could almost imagine a parent begrudgingly, this isn't something that they would ever want to do, something they would ever want to see happen or see occur. It was something very serious. It meant potentially even the actual pronouncement of some kind of ungodly curse upon a mother or father, maybe even bringing in the demonic realm upon them, invoking the gods of the nations that they were meant to displace as a way to bring a curse upon their parents. This was hardly ever enforced in Israel, which, as I said earlier, has led some to believe that this punishment, it was a way for God to say it could go up to this punishment, but it's also possible they were just disobedient and didn't do what God had told them to do. But God's design here is to preserve and protect the family structure. A capital crime for someone to lash out against their parents, to strike their parents, to be a stubborn or rebellious child, a drunkard, according to Deuteronomy 21, verse 18 to 21. So the idea here is the family must be respected. So again, God is just trying to keep the order in its proper place. In verse 8, which we already read, he calls himself the Lord who sanctifies you. He says, I am the Lord who sanctifies you. And this is the first instance in Leviticus where God describes himself that way. And what a beautiful picture of God. He's the one who takes his people and he sets his people apart. And I hope that you can see God in that way, that God is trying to take you. We are now a kingdom of priests. We are God's covenant people. We're his chosen people. He is trying to take you as the church. He's trying to set you apart from the world. You know, the pull of this world is so strong. The messages of this world, the philosophies of this world, they're just so strong. And they're constantly preaching at us, pulling us, trying to get us into compromise. And we've got to realize, but there's God. He's the Lord, and he is sanctifying us. He is trying to pull us out of all of that and separate us unto himself, and for his work here on earth. And so we've got to be with the Lord in this process of sanctification. That's why he says in verse 7 to the people of Israel, consecrate yourselves. Consecrate yourselves. Now, as the text goes on, we get into all these different other community sins. And again, many of them might seem to be private in nature. And so you might even, as we read through them, think to yourself, gosh, these are private, personal sins. To borrow our modern terminology, there's often consent involved in these sins, which are mostly sexual throughout the rest of the chapter. But they, in ancient Israel, required the death penalty. And so you might say to yourself, gosh, there's consent, they're private, what's wrong? Well, I think as we go through these, what you'll be able to see rather easily is that though there's consent and though it would happen in a private manner, not publicly before everyone else, these sins affected society in some very serious ways. And I think if we're honest, we would have to confess that these things still affect society in some serious ways. And especially the society of the church is greatly harmed when some of these things occur, many of which are reiterated in the New Testament, which, of course, as a reminder, is what we're looking for as we go through the book of Leviticus, because Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament law. So what parts of this are reiterated in the New Testament? And many of these sins that are mentioned here are mentioned again in the New Testament era. So let's read together. In verse 10, it says, "If a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death." So again, you've got a man, there's another woman, the wife of his neighbor. It doesn't have to be his literal next door neighbor, but just it's another man's wife is the idea. And both of them, they engage each other sexually. He says the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. Now, interestingly enough, in the hands of men who abused the law, this requirement was forgotten in many ways. For instance, in the life of Jesus, though it's a disputed text in John chapter 8, there was a moment where the religious leaders brought a woman who was caught in adultery and threw her at the feet of Jesus and said, the law said that she needs to, die. What do you say? And of course, Jesus wrote on the ground for a while. And he said, he who has no sin, let him cast the first stone. And one by one, all of them departed until it was just Jesus and the woman with an onlooking crowd. And he said, "Woman, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." But I tell that story just to point out that they weren't thinking about the adulterer in that situation, just the adulteress. But here, both are involved. Verse 11, he says, "If a man lies with his father's wife, he has uncovered his father's nakedness. Both of them shall surely be put to death. Their blood is upon them. If a man lies with his daughter-in-law, both of them shall surely be put to death. They have committed perversion. Their blood is upon them. If a man lies with a male, as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood is upon them." So again, we have a continuation of this theme of sexual sins. And of course, in our modern moment, I have to point out, just as I did when we were in chapter 18, the sin of homosexuality in God's sight. And obviously, many have ridiculed the book of Leviticus and ridiculed believers for thinking about the book of Leviticus when building their arguments for a modern sexual ethic, saying things like, well, hey, if you think homosexuality is a sin, then you also shouldn't be eating shellfish because you're only getting that from the book of Leviticus. But this is not true. As I pointed out in our last study, the book of Romans especially, but many other places throughout the New Testament, and all of the Bible from even before the law, the book of Genesis, for instance, the Garden of Eden record, they affirm and communicate in a rock-solid way that God's ideal is marriage between a man and a woman for life, and that is the exclusive space that we're to live out our sexual desires, the exclusive space that we're to engage another human sexually. And so this is a continuation of this, and here you have a man who, he says, is lying with another man as if he was a woman. So that, again, is the idea of homosexuality, which, of course, many have come to accept in our modern time with statements like love is love, or follow your heart, or whatever you want to do, whatever makes you happy. But again, the framework that I'm trying to present with this chapter is that God saw each one of these sins amongst his people as something that would destroy the community. It just breaks the order that God has designed. Just as a child being offered to Molech by a parent breaks the order of what God has designed for that parent to be, so a man engaging another man sexually breaks the order of what God has designed for that society and culture. And it doesn't just affect those two men, it would affect and have ramifications upon their network of relationships, people's vision of what sexuality means. The children that are below them, younger than them, those that were older than them, their parents, and the grief they would experience in their own hearts. There are all kinds of reverberations. The fact that these two men would not be having children, that would be a blessing to that community, so a less numerous and prosperous society. There are all kinds of impacts of our sin, including this one. So I'm not trying to pick on this one in particular, though God does give it the designation and abomination. My point is merely I need to talk about it because it's such a highlighted subject in our modern time. I have a friend in our fellowship who has said in the past, he's a same-sex attracted Christian. So he loves Jesus. For whatever reason, he has an attraction to men, and he's prayed through that and doesn't want to be that way, but that's just the way that it is. But he knows he's not going to live that out because, in his words, you just can't honestly look at the Bible and conclude that homosexuality is something that God has allowed. An honest look at Scripture helps us understand that everything outside of marriage between a man and a woman is something that's forbidden. But I think an important attitude for all Christians to have is the attitude that we are all, in some way, shape, or form, because of the presence of sin in this world, we are broken people, and that will include brokenness in our sexuality. We're going to have desires and wants and cravings that are just out of line with God and His desires. And I think we need to be honest about that. Even a person who's, faithfully being obedient to the Lord with their sexuality, there's going to be temptations that come into their lives that are out of line with God and His Word. If the Bible is true, and we have a flesh, and there's a devil, and we live in a broken and fallen world, then we are all going to experience temptations that grate against us because of the brokenness that's within, the brokenness in our society. And so we've got to be honest about that, that any one of us could do any of these things that are mentioned in this chapter. He goes on and says in verse 14, verse 14, if a man takes a woman and her mother also, it is depravity. He and they shall be burned with fire, that there may be no depravity among you. Now, this is interesting because, again, it is the death penalty, but it's designated peculiarly as they need to be burned with fire. So how that looked is hard to understand, but this was a grave sin. If a man lies with an animal, he shall surely be put to death, and you shall also kill the animal. If a woman approaches any animal and lies with it, you shall kill the woman and the animal, and they shall surely be put to death. Their blood is upon them. If a man takes his sister, a daughter of his father or a daughter of his mother, and sees her nakedness, and she sees his nakedness, it is a disgrace, and they shall be cut off in the sight of the children of their people. He has uncovered his sister's nakedness, and he shall bear his iniquity. If a man lies with a woman during her menstrual period and uncovers her nakedness, he has made naked her fountain, and she has uncovered the fountain of her blood. Both of them shall be cut off from among their people. Again, the blood being very important in the eyes of God, especially in that Old Testament era. So again, just a portion of a list of sins, sexual sins that someone would need to be put to death for there in ancient Israel. Now, under normal conditions, these laws would deter this kind of behavior. But I do want to point out that with substance abuse, a lot of these things would become more predominant. In other words, people become emboldened to do things that they know have grave consequences attached to them. They become emboldened to do them through the use of substance, through the abuse of substance. So it's like part of me wants to say, man, this would have been a great deterrent. A lot of these things would not have happened because the death penalty is attached to them. But you get alcohol in the mix, abuse of alcohol in the mix. And you can start to see how some of these things could have begun to occur. And that's why so many of the religions around Israel or among the Canaanite people involve these parties and festivals where you could become inebriated. It kind of loosened someone up to do things that they normally wouldn't do. Verse 19, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your mother's sister or of your father's sister, for that is to make naked one's relative. They shall bear their iniquity. If a man lies with his uncle's wife, he has uncovered his uncle's nakedness. They shall bear their sin. They shall die childless. If a man takes his brother's wife, it is impurity. He has uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless. Now, this, to me, it's hard to know exactly what the judgment of being childless necessarily looks like. Obviously, the capital punishment is something that humans would administrate, but this childlessness seems at face value reading to be divine intervention. And so perhaps that's the way things occurred, but somehow this was a punishment, of course, lesser than losing your life, but still grave. Verse 22, you shall therefore keep all my statutes and all my rules and do them, that the land where I am bringing you to live may not vomit you out. And you shall not walk in the customs of the nation that I am driving out before you, for they did all these things, and therefore I detested them. Now, for the people of Israel, here's this description that he has of them going into the land of Canaan, displacing the people in Canaan and creating this nation that was meant to be a kingdom of priests, representative of God to the nations around them. And for us in our time, of course, we have a different reality. We don't have a specific piece of land physically that is ours to become our nation, so to speak, as much as, for instance, a nation like the United States of America. I think we have a really unique place in human history and an incredible Christian heritage in many ways, even though we have plenty of our own sins and crimes that we've committed and all of that to help build our nation. But an incredible Christian, heritage, but we're never like Israel was in the Old Testament era, a land that was just, this is God's specific place. You want to know God, that's where you go. For us, what we have is the cultures, the Canaanite, so to speak, cultures of the world all around us. We're living in the world, yet we're meant to be not of the world. So when Israel went into the promised land, they were to displace the Canaanite culture from the land. We're to displace the Canaanite culture, so to speak, from our hearts. We're to allow the Lord to change us from the inside out. We are God's dwelling place now, today. And so when he says this here, you've got to make sure that you don't compromise with the surrounding nations, lest the land vomit you out. And of course, this did occur for the people of Israel. They would eventually be destroyed in the north of Israel by the Assyrians and brought into captivity in the south of Israel by the Babylonians because of their sin, because of compromise. So we've got to watch out for compromise in our lives. He says in verse 24, but I've said to you, you shall inherit the land, and I will give it to you to possess, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God who has separated you from the peoples. You shall therefore separate the clean beast from the unclean, and the unclean bird from the clean. You shall not make yourself detestable by beast or by bird or by anything with which the ground crawls, which I have set apart for you to hold unclean. You shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy and have separated you from the peoples that you should be mine. A man or a woman who is a medium or a necromancer shall surely be put to death. They shall be stoned with stones. Their blood shall be upon them. So again, in the closing verses of chapter 20, God here clarifies to them, look, I'm bringing you into this land that's a beautiful land, a land flowing with milk and honey. The idea of flowing milk and honey is really simple. It's just a prosperous place. I mean, imagine it. If it's flowing with milk, then what does that mean? Well, you have lots of livestock, milk-producing livestock. And what do you need for a lot of milk-producing livestock to be around? Well, you need lush, fertile lands for them to graze. So it means it's a fertile land. And then what do you need to have lots of honey? Well, you need to have a lot of bees. And so you got a lot of bees cruising around pollinating things. So lots of fruit and vegetables and produce would have been in that region with God's blessing upon it. So God's bringing them to this fruitful, prosperous place. And he tells them, look, I'm separating you. I took you out of Egypt. I separated you from Egypt. I took you and cleansed you, and took you out of the unclean Egypt, and I want you to do the same thing. I want you to separate the clean and unclean animals. I want you to separate yourself from mediums and necromancers that are unclean. I want you to separate yourself, be consecrated. And so again, of course, the exhortation for us to be a consecrated, separated people. Now, in Leviticus chapter 21, we get into restrictions for the priestly service. So we've now thought about a lot of different sins that God would judge in very severe ways, or wanted judged in very severe ways. And now we come to the priesthood. And really, what this chapter will help us remember is that the priests were called to be holy men. They, like the people of Israel, were meant to be set apart. There were standards upon the lives of these spiritual leaders that were higher even than for the normal men and women throughout Israel. So the earlier chapters, we've thought about the average Israelite, but now we get into what God expects of the priests. So in verse 1, it says, "And the Lord said to Moses, speak to the priests, the sons of Aaron, and say to them, no one shall make himself unclean for the dead among his people, except for his closest relatives, his mother, his father, his son, his daughter, his brother, or his virgin sister who is near to him because she has no husband. For her he may make himself unclean. He shall not make himself unclean as a husband among his people and so profane himself." All right, so what this is talking about is if a priest is on duty, he's working, serving the Lord in the temple or the tabernacle, and someone dies, he's not supposed to leave the tabernacle and then be involved with, touch that dead body, unless he's allowed to do this if they are one of these close relatives that is listed in these first 4 verses. The interesting thing is that the priest's wife is omitted from this list, which a lot of people just assume, well, she must have been counted. Maybe, the two being one flesh just meant that, of course, he was going to go and care for her, but still an interesting omission that's there. The idea is that a relative, that's what he says there, so perhaps it's just flesh and blood, so she's a more obvious one that didn't even need to be named. He says in verse 5, "They shall not make bald patches on their heads, nor shave off the edges of their beard, nor make any cuts on their body. They shall be holy to their God and not profane the name of their God, for they offer the Lord's food offerings, the bread of their God, therefore they shall be holy." Some of these things that are mentioned, the shaving of the head, the cutting off the edges of their beard, making cuts on their bodies. As I've mentioned earlier, this isn't God's way of saying to us in the modern era, don't shave your head, don't trim up your facial hair, and don't get a tattoo. That's not the timeless principle that we would find here. For them, what they were doing, if they had done these things, it would be mimicking the surrounding nations and their priesthoods and some of the things that they would do to worship their false gods. And so God is saying to his priests, that's not the way you're going to roll. You're not going to shave your head, trim your beard in a certain way, or cut your body, make certain markings on your body to indicate your devotion to me. You're not going to do any of that stuff. You're separate unto me. And so, for us, it helps us understand again and afresh that we will be different. We don't take our cues from society and the world. We're a different people. He says in verse 7, they shall not marry a prostitute or a woman who's been defiled. Neither shall they marry a woman divorced from her husband, for the priest is holy to his God. You shall sanctify him, for he offers the bread of your God. He shall be holy to you, for I, the Lord, who sanctify you, am holy. And the daughter of any priest, if she profanes herself by whoring, profanes her father, she shall be burned with fire. Now, this is a real sobering little paragraph that we just read. The priests, and again, this is not about the high priest, although they will be included and talked about in the coming verses, but the general priesthood, they were not to marry a certain kind of woman. He says here, prostitutes, a woman who's been defiled, or a woman divorced from her husband. Probably the reason for this is to preserve the purity of the priesthood. Racially, they were meant to come from the Levites, to come from Aaron as the high priests, and so they're preserving that lineage in one sense. But also there's likely something here about the family of the spiritual leaders, that they needed to be set apart themselves. God, in the midst of all of this, says, I'm holy. This is part of the reason why you need to be this way. The motivation is that I am a holy God, so I need holy representatives. Their lives need to be set apart to me. And I think there are some principles of this that carry forward into the New Testament era. Paul, when describing elders or pastors in the New Testament, he describes them as men who are able to know how to and are leading or managing their own household well, having their children in submission. And there's, debate and discussion about the age that a child is kind of just on their own. Obviously, I think most of us would agree, once a child is grown up and they leave their father's home, if they were to begin to walk away from God at that stage of life, that shouldn't disqualify a pastor whose adult child has walked away from the Lord. Each person has to make their own decision as well as to whether they're going to receive Jesus and walk with him. No family is immune from the temptations that pull against children as they grow up in our modern world and society. But there's something about the level of discipline and leadership that a pastor meets out within his home. He can't guarantee the justification, sanctification, and glorification of his children, but he can have a leadership voice within his home. And the idea there for pastors seems to be, look, if he can't do it there, then he's not going to be able to do it well within the house of God. And this is meant to be the ideal Christian man. That's the description of elders there in 1 Timothy 3 and in Titus chapter 2. Titus chapter 1. But here, the priest, his family needs to